Let's study Chapter 4, Principles of Protection and Utilization of Historic Buildings. We understand the development of historical building protection and the relevant urban planning and renewal theories which have profound significance for the historic building protection. So we realize that antique protection is not suitable for the large number of general historic buildings in cities today, but instead it is adaptive reuse of historic buildings. Although the protection of historic buildings is not defined by the protection of cultural relics, it also needs to follow certain principles and guidelines so that historic buildings can be better protected and reused. This chapter is about the 4 aspects of protection and utilization of historic buildings: the principle of authenticity, the principle of sustainable development, the principle of integrity, and the principle of compatibility. First of all, let's look at the principle of authenticity and the principle of sustainable development. The so-called authenticity, that is, truthfulness, its core content has the following 2 aspects. First, it refers to the originality, non-replication, and other characteristics of the object being explored and researched. Second, just because the objects have characteristics as originality, non-replication, etc., such objects naturally possess another attribute, namely authenticity, certainty, and reliability. Therefore, in a sense, the word authenticity itself implies a causal logic of truthfulness because of original. John Ruskin, a representative of the British anti-repair movement, urged that it be protected, reserved, and maintained, where is the first appearance of authenticity. The authenticity not only emphasizes the preservation of the true and pure state of historical buildings, but also emphasizes the importance of preserving the changes, levels, and traces of years in different historical periods. In the process of preservation and reuse of historical buildings, the principle of authenticity means that the historical buildings under different cultural backgrounds should be respected to the maximum extent. Their different creation and development history should be respected. In each historic building, it is necessary to respect the original to the maximum extent and at the same time to continue its existence as long as possible. As for the objects of historic buildings existing in different forms and states, the principle of respecting the original objects is embodied in the following aspects. The first point is reflected readability of historical information. The historical information carried by the historic building should be readable, and the intervention design in different periods should not be confused with the original elements of a historic building, so as to keep the identifiable character between them. Roman Colosseum, while sealing the vault to strengthen it, Stern did not restore the cracked part to its position, but deliberately retained the instantaneous position of the cracked or even about the collapse, thus solidifying history and preserving the historical truth. Respect for the original, and the second point is reversibility of protective measures. No historic building can keep its original state completely. Therefore, the protection of historic building refers to the protection of its own characteristics while adapting to the needs of the times, not to prohibit change, but to control its development. In this sense, extending the useful life of historic buildings means understanding the life of historic buildings over centuries rather than decades and maintaining them continuously without changing undamaged structures, using materials that are already well known for their performance, using reusability techniques, and having any intervention documented and with purpose. We should have a dialectical understanding of the reversibility in the preservation of historical buildings. For the existing historic buildings with good condition and long durability of materials, the protection work may go well. For those historic buildings whose existing condition is poor or whose building materials are not durable, the refusal to use protective materials for rescue technical protection is likely to make the basic material form and humanistic information of historic buildings weathered and destroyed or even disappeared. In fact, it is difficult to realize the reversibility of the process of historical building protection technology, and the reversible process is more idle in theory. Therefore, today we study the principle of reversibility in the preservation and the reuse of historic buildings, often using the two concepts of suitability principle and the reprocessing principle. These two principles represent a more sustainable protection strategy while emphasizing the importance of maintenance. The material to be processed for suitability has no negative impact. Reprocessing requires current protection treatment that does not include or hinder future treatment. These principles are considered to imply the importance of maintenance, or that the next step is not the last. The above is the principle of preservation and reuse of historic buildings. Next, we will learn the second principle of sustainable development. The thought of sustainable development has been introduced to you in Chapter 3, that is, the development that not only satisfies the needs of temporary people, but also does not harm the ability of future generations to meet their needs. In 1992, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development held in Brazil adopted Agenda 21 of the Implementation Framework for Sustainable Development, which put sustainable development from concept to practice. China's Agenda 21, formulated by our government in 1994, clearly states that sustainable development will be the guiding principle for China's long-term economic and social development plan. According to Agenda 21, sustainable development should be a harmonious balance among environmental, social, and economic aspects. Economic growth, environmental protection, and healthy social development, namely a balance among environment, economy, and society. In the process of conservation and reuse of historic buildings, the principles of sustainable development must be followed, which are embodied in the following three aspects: environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social cultural sustainability. First, let's learn the principle of environmental sustainability. The principle of environmental sustainability, mainly referring to existing building components and equipment that can be continuously used, shall be retained as far as possible. The components removed during reconstruction and the abandoned equipment are recycled in other forms as far as possible. The design strategy of retrofitting should reduce the consumption of environmental resources as much as possible. When resource or energy is needed, the resource and energy will small environmental impact, while the source and renewable recovery are preferred. Use of local materials to reduce energy transport. The second aspect is the principle of economic sustainability, reflected in the following requirements. One is the initial investment of historic building protection and reuse should be moderate, and the initial investment should be recovered in a short time. Another is reducing operating costs by reducing energy costs can be achieved through green energy saving. Take the Hearst Tower in the United States as an example, which is the first office building in New York to be certified by the U.S. Green Building Council LEED at the time of its opening. The building uses 10,480 tons of steel, and the use of recycled steel accounts for more than 85% of the total steel consumption, which saves 26% of the energy than the construction using ordinary steel. Floor and ceiling tiles are also made of recyclable materials. Compared with the office building around it, the building can achieve 25% energy saving. The third is it will bring more economic income and promote regional economic prosperity. The third aspect is social culture sustainability principles, reflected in the following requirements. Use of local resources to support local development. Providing better use space, making the user's life and work more enjoyable. Promote the development and the vitality of the protected areas of historical buildings. The historical and cultural values in historical buildings can be continued and even increased, improving the aesthetic appearance of the building. In this section, we mainly study the authenticity and sustainable development principles of the protection principles of historic buildings.